So let's go ahead and finish up chapter 14, where we're finally getting through the rest of the nervous system. So we're going to finish up going over the autonomic system, going into the autonomic synapse, the effects, and the reflexes. So we're going to talk about synapse. We're going to talk about signaling molecules and receptors involved in communicating within the autonomic nervous system. We're going to talk about the effects of it, and when we're talking about regulating other organ systems, we'll talk about autonomic tone and dual innervation, and then somatic and autonomic reflexes, and then look at the difference between short and long reflexes from a structural standpoint. So autonomic synapses, with these we have these postganglionic axons that have these changes to ones called varicosities. We'll see these in a picture in just a second. At each of these varicosities, we're going to see a bunch of neurotransmitters held in vesicles. And so remember, neurotransmitters in these vesicles, they're going to merge with the membrane, spill these neurotransmitters into that gap so that they can be received by a receptor on the target organ. In this case, since we're talking about autonomic, we're talking about smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, right? Visceral organs are going to be the ones receiving this. So we have varicosities that contain neurotransmitters that spill out towards the target organ. The target organ has neurotransmitter receptors that can bind with that neurotransmitter so that we can cause some sort of effect. So this is what we're looking at. So we see like this again, this little swelling, little bubble-like structure, and we see the this is the varicosity, right? All these vesicles inside. These little green dots represent the neurotransmitters. They can fuse, spill those neurotransmitters into this area here, and then the cell, the target organ can receive those through a receptor. Now, the type of neurotransmitters we use in the autonomic system depends on which side or which division of the autonomic system we're looking at. We're primarily looking at acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Now, acetylcholine should sound familiar since we talked about it in the muscular system. We talked about muscle contraction and the nervous system being the one controlling that muscle contraction through acetylcholine. But norepinephrine may be new. Sometimes you may see it called noradrenaline. We also have epinephrine, also known as adrenaline too. I'm going to use norepinephrine and epinephrine for this class, right? But if you write adrenaline or noradrenaline, I'll know what you mean. So these are the two main neurotransmitters we're using, acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Now, the adrenal medulla, which remember has a hardwire, like direct line with the nervous system, is in a way a modified sympathetic ganglion that releases epinephrine. And that's going to be part of your fight or flight response. Acetylcholine can bind to two different types of receptors, nicotinic and muscarinic. Right, so acetylcholine is a little bit of, I won't say a dual purpose, but it has some wiggle room in terms of which receptors it can bind to, whereas norepinephrine and epinephrine bind to adrenergic receptors. Now, when we're looking at the neurotransmitters, this is a lot of text. We're going to try to sum it up nice and sweetly in terms of who's releasing which neurotransmitter and for what. So the first thing first, the preganglionic fibers. So all preganglionic fibers, whether we're looking at sympathetic or parasympathetic, they're all what's called cholinergic, and they release acetylcholine, right? So cholinergic, acetylcholine, we see that similarity in the name. So the preganglionic fibers are all going to use acetylcholine, no matter what. And that means all of the ganglionic neurons that get the signals from the preganglionic fibers have nicotinic receptors in their membranes because nicotinic receptors respond to acetylcholine. So no matter what, preganglionic always releases acetylcholine. Ganglionic always respond to acetylcholine. And then once we get to the postganglionic fibers, this is where we split. We're gonna speak in absolutes, but keep in mind this is a most case scenario. But sympathetic postganglionic fibers, they're adrenergic, so they're going to release norepinephrine. We get the epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. This is fight or flight. Remember, sympathetic, fight or flight. So norepinephrine, epinephrine coming from the sympathetic postganglionic axons. The parasympathetic postganglionic are cholinergic, so they're going to continue with acetylcholine. So we see a difference in terms of in the postganglionic fibers. If it's a sympathetic postganglionic, we're releasing norepinephrine. If we're a parasympathetic postganglionic fiber, we're releasing acetylcholine. Now, the target cells that respond to these, like epinephrine, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, they have all different types and subtypes of receptors, and depending on their type of receptor and the neurotransmitter that binds to it, if the neurotransmitter can bind to it, is going to lead to that difference in responses. If you decide to go further in, you'll learn about how there's, all different receptors that respond to the same neurotransmitter, they respond to the same hormone, they respond to the same chemical, but there's some slight differences in the receptor itself so that the effect that comes after the fact is a little different. The one that's weird, I guess we could say weird, is the sympathetic postganglionic fibers that work with the blood vessels in like the skeletal muscle and sweat glands, like in the skin. These ones will release acetylcholine instead of norepinephrine, but that doesn't matter because there is no parasympathetic input, so there is no parasympathetic side also releasing acetylcholine. It's either acetylcholine or nothing, so to speak. So here's just some quick little tables, and I recommend pausing this or looking at the book if I'm going too fast, but I'm just going to go over a couple things here. Do take the time to look at these tables since it does give a good summary. But one thing we notice going down this list, right? Preganglionic releases acetylcholine, right? For both sympathetic, parasympathetic. Again, that stays the same. Doesn't matter which side we're on, we're going to. On the ganglionic neurons, acetylcholine, right, with the receptors. So ganglionic neurons, they are going to have acetylcholine receptors, which again makes sense because the preganglionic axons release the acetylcholine. The ganglionic neurons that communicate with the preganglionic axons have to have receptors for that acetylcholine. If either is missing, the acetylcholine or the receptors, there's no talking going on between those two. Postganglionic. On the sympathetic side, we're mainly going to release norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is only blood vessels in the muscle and sweat glands. For the parasympathetic side is all acetylcholine. And then the adrenal medulla, it's just releasing epinephrine. It's just part of the sympathetic division. It's not going to do anything with the parasympathetic. So now we get to autonomic tone and dual innervation. So there's really a balance that we're trying to strike between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions, right? So usually they're each trying to affect some sort of change, they're trying to cause some sort of change. And usually we're talking about competing directions, meaning that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions are kind of bringing opposites, right? One thing's going to push in one direction, the other will push in the opposite direction. For the most part, that's not always the case, but most of the time, you can make an assumption that most of the time, parasympathetic and sympathetic are working opposite of each other. And that we're trying to balance somewhere in the middle so that we're not always overloaded, remember, in fight or flight, but we're also not always in rest or digest, that we're somewhere in the middle for the most part. When it comes to each organ system, they may swing further towards sympathetic or parasympathetic, like they might have a tendency towards one or the other. That's known as the autonomic tone for that system. And then a lot of the effector organs have dual innervation, meaning they're actually going to get information for both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. So they're getting competing signals. right? And it's kind of like who's going to win out, right? And that can shift depending on what's going on. Sometimes we get opposing effects without dual innervation because we just have sympathetic innervation. We don't have parasympathetic innervation. We'll see that in a table in just a second. And sometimes they don't have opposite effects. Sometimes they actually will cooperate. But in general, if you were to say generally that the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are opposite of each other, I would understand that. So let's look at some of the things. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these because this is a list and I don't want to read to you, but I do want you to, pause here and look through this table if you can, or at least look at it in your book. But I'm going to pick out a few of these just to kind of talk about, especially to show like when you have opposite things as well as when there is no opposite, it's just one. So let's look at like the erector pili muscles, right? So they're either contracted or relaxed, right? They only will contract if there's a sympathetic effect, right? That's a sympathetic effect. On the parasympathetic side, there is no effect. They don't do anything. So that's one where we have a sympathetic one. We don't need to have a parasympathetic effect to counter that. Versus like with the heart, the sympathetic effect is to increase the heart rate, right? Fight or flight, right? Get that heart pumping. Versus parasympathetic, rest and digest, heart rate decreases, it's more relaxed, right? So that one we see opposite. With the blood vessels in the heart, so the coronary arteries, the coronary and like the cardiac veins, like the blood vessels that actually service the heart. With the parasympathetic, we see vasodilation, so an opening, right? They're opening up. And the sympathetic, though, it could be either way, vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So interesting, this one we could see the two systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic, working together, creating the same effect. Or not, depending on what's going on. Over here, we see a lot of opposites. So like with the gallbladder, we see that the sympathetic effect inhibits it, parasympathetic stimulates it. And you'll notice like with the GI tract ones, like the GI tract gland secretion, the gallbladder, peristalsis, which is the movement of like food through your digestive system. You'll notice sympathetic inhibits, parasympathetic stimulates, which if you think about what the purposes of each, it makes sense because sympathetic, we're typically thinking fight or flight. We're talking about immediate survival. What do we need to do right now? Food is not a necessity in that moment, and so we can kind of put that on the back burner. Versus rest and digest, we can have that take center stage. Not every sympathetic or parasympathetic effect has to do with like immediate danger or absolute relaxation. If we look at like the penis, for example, we see that the parasympathetic side is going to stimulate an erection, and then the sympathetic side, the fight or flight response, is going to stimulate an ejaculation. So while we've been talking about that, like fight or flight versus rest and digest for the most part, and that helps us at least with a lot of these, kind of understanding what's going on, why do we get that effect. It's not always strictly like sympathetic only kicks in when you're in danger or you think you're in danger. It's just a term we use to kind of explain a good chunk of the effects we see. But like some things like ejaculation, that's not something that you're really concerned about if your life is in danger. But it is part of the sympathetic effects. So let's talk about some reflexes now. So we have somatic reflexes and autonomic or visceral reflexes. Somatic reflexes, we've talked about at least one of these before. We talked about the withdrawal reflex, right? You touch, like the figure of the guy touching a burning candle, because that makes sense. But he touches the burning candle, and what happens? You immediately pull your hand back because it hurts, right? You don't have to think about it. You're thinking about how it hurts while your hand is already pulling back. So that's an automatic response involving skeletal muscles because you're pulling your hand away. Versus autonomic reflexes, these are ones that you still have no control over because it's a reflex, but it involves the autonomic nervous system, so like your heart, the smooth muscles, glands. Like if you start sweating, you're just starting to sweat, right, as a reflex. And then so this next one though, this one's actually something I think is kind of cool. And that has to do with referred pain and the afferent branch. So there is a similarity between the somatic reflex and the visceral reflex in that it's the afferent branch. This is what's going to bring information towards the central nervous system. So these sensory neurons, right, they're getting information from some sort of receptor that's in the peripheral nervous system. The cell bodies, like using the cell bodies from the sensory ganglia, and then like a cranial nerve or a dorsal root ganglion that's next to the spinal cord, and then project that into the central nervous system to cause a reflex, right? So we go sensory neuron from the peripheral, sensory ganglia, towards the central nervous system, cause some sort of effect, send out motor output. So like most of the time you're not really aware of like your visceral sensations, like you're not aware of the sensory information that's coming in from your like deeper organs, but sometimes that sensation can be really strong, so strong that you're actually consciously aware of it. The weird thing though that happens is that you won't feel the pain or you won't feel that sensation in the spot where that organ is. You'll have like this pattern of projection that is called what we call referred pain. And so you can have like a problem in one area and yet you'll feel it in a totally different body part. It's not totally different, like completely unrelated, but if you're not aware of referred pain, you might think that something else is wrong with you. And it depends on the organ system or the organ that's affected. The referred pain will project to different areas, but it's generally pretty consistent. So let's go ahead and look at a map of some of those referred pains that we can experience. And then I'll talk about like one of my experiences with referred pain and how kind of strange it is. But like let's say it's appendix, right? Your appendix is really little and yet you could feel pain in this entire region. With the kidney, right? Your kidneys are just they're about fist sized, and yet you could feel a pain anywhere in like this lower region, even down into the legs, right? With the heart, this is especially common. Keep in mind, this is the guy's left, right? This is especially common if someone has a heart attack, or you may have heard like, oh, they have weakness or they have pain in their left arm, right? That's referred pain. And then for my own example, right, I'm not going to go through all these, but my own example, so a few years ago, I had to have surgery done. They did a laparoscopic surgery, so they did the little tiny incisions and they stick the tools in, and one of the things they do to give themselves room to work is they will actually pump carbon dioxide into the abdominal cavity and kind of blow you up like a little balloon. So they do that. And then when they're done, you know, before they close you up, they kind of like deflate you, right? Kind of push all that out. But the carbon dioxide, there's going to be a little bit left behind from them opening you up. And it causes irritation to the diaphragm, right? The muscle that is just kind of forming the top of your abdominal cavity. But you don't feel the pain down at like your ribs or anything. You feel it in your shoulder, like we see here, lung and diaphragm. So I actually felt pain and irritation in my shoulder, even though it was my diaphragm that was being irritated right after this surgery. The difference between the somatic and the visceral reflex, so like what we talked about just now, like before, that was like this thing that we keep the same. This is the difference between them, and that's the efferent branch. This is how we go with output. So we see a similarity between the somatic reflex and the visceral reflex when we bring information in, which is why again we can have this crossover with like the referred pain. But when it comes to the output, that's the difference we see with the somatic and the visceral reflex, the efferent branch, right? Because remember, afferent arrives, efferent exits. And so with the somatic reflex, right, we have this lower motor neuron coming out of the ventral horn, and it's going to go right to the muscle. But with the visceral reflex, we have a go-between, right? So we have the preganglionic fiber coming from that lateral horn, right, or the cranial neuron, neuron to a ganglion, and then we have a postganglionic fiber going to the target effector. So main difference here is somatic reflex, we use one, right? We have one neuron really involved. Visceral reflex, we have two. So this is what we're looking at. We have the autonomic versus somatic efferent pathway. In the autonomic, here's our first one. So our autonomic presynaptic, right, axon. So the pre-ganglionic neuron. Here's our ganglion, right? And then here's our post-ganglionic axon. So two players. Versus somatic, it's just one all the way through, one and done. Now with a long reflex, right, the afferent branches are going to enter the spinal cord or brain and then involve the efferent branches. Versus a short reflex, we're actually not even going to use the central nervous system. So long reflex, we do use the central nervous system because we are going into the spinal cord or the brain and then exiting back out. The short reflex, this is just sensory neurons going and synapsing right with the motor neurons inside of an autonomic ganglia. No central nervous system, no spinal cord, no brain involved. When we're looking at short reflexes, we're looking at the enteric nervous system, which we think GI, right? We're thinking in the abdominal region, we're thinking with digestion. But this is what those would look like. And so here's the long reflex. This is what we've pretty much been talking about when it comes to reflexes, like the withdrawal reflex. We saw this pathway where we receive a sensation, we take it to the spinal cord process, send it back out. Bam, done. Short reflex though, no spinal cord involved. Sensory receptor cell, right to the peripheral ganglion, and then right back out to cause some sort of effect. All right, last thing we're going to get into, and this is relatively short, we're going to talk about the higher centers in the brain for autonomic regulation, talk about the hypothalamus and its role, the amygdala and its role, and then the medulla and some pathways that are important with the autonomic system. So the main players in controlling the autonomic nervous system are the cerebral cortex, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, which will include like the hippocampus and the amygdala, and the medulla oblongata and spinal cord. Now the hypothalamus kind of is one major player in this, in that it handles a lot of your like rudimentary behaviors, so to speak. So like driving you to be thirsty or hungry, right? Whether or not someone wants something like sex, right? Those kinds of things can come, like those basic kind of, I like to call it like the caveman parts, right? Are coming from the hypothalamus. And it's really because it's trying to keep you in homeostasis, right? Keep you in balance. So it'll handle, like I mentioned, things like, are you thirsty? Are you hungry? Are you in the mood? But also your blood pressure. It'll be involved with like maintaining your body temperature. It'll be involved with helping maintain whether you sleep or not, right? To some degree. So it kind of, like I said, it's like the caveman part of the brain, so to speak. This is going to drive pupillary reflexes. So we're talking about like with your pupils, right? The reflexes we see in the pupils of your eyes. The input is going to come from the optic nerve and the medial forebrain bundle, which has the olfactory cortex, basal nuclei, and amygdala. And then output will come from one or two, dorsal longitudinal fasciculus or the medial forebrain bundle. And kind of like go right back out. So this is what we're looking at. So in orange here, we see the medial forebrain bundle, and then in pink here, we see the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. Right, so we see like connecting to the ocular motor cortex, the dorsal motor nucleus, the nucleus ambiguus, connecting to all of those guys with the hypothalamus. And we'll talk more about the hypothalamus too in the next chapter when we get into the endocrine system, because I like to call it kind of like the bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine. So let's go ahead now and talk about the amygdala and the brainstem. The amygdala is like this little like blackberry-like structure. It's a bunch of nuclei in the medial region of the temporal lobe, so it's kind of like in the middle, right? And it's part of the limbic system or the limbic lobe. It's going to help influence the hypothalamus, right? So it's going to kind of play with the hypothalamus in terms of control. The medulla oblongata We've talked about this a little bit. We talked about how it works with the pons to control some of the very basic things like maintaining your heartbeat and maintaining your respiratory rate. And so we do have the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata. This is going to control your smooth and your cardiac muscle, so that basically we can make sure like your heart is beating. And then the brainstem nuclei, for like the solitary nucleus, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve, the nucleus ambiguus, those are going to be important for visceral control, which makes sense to me. Think about the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is really one of the big ones when it comes to controlling all of the viscera, the organs we find in your abdominal cavity. So if you remember from the cranial nerves, if you don't, I would go back and look at that one. You're going to have to know vagus nerve, so don't forget that one. Right, this is just what this looks like. So we have our hippocampus here in like pink. We have the amygdala right here. Here's the hypothalamic nuclei, corpus callosum in orange, right? Thalamus in like this lighter orange, and then the cingulate gyrus up above that, kind of hugging over the top of that diencephalon.